In the heart of Miami, a city known for its vibrant culture and sun-kissed beaches, a tale unfolded that would forever alter the lives of many. Marcus Johnson, a respected preacher, had long been the cornerstone of his community. His unwavering faith and dedication to his family made him a beacon of hope for many. But beneath the surface of his seemingly perfect life, a storm was brewing, one that would destroy his world. The revelation came like a thunderclap. His wife, Tanya, and his father, Clarence, had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way. This discovery set off a chain of events that would lead to a tragedy that no one saw coming. As Marcus grappled with the depth of this betrayal, he found himself at a crossroads. Would he seek justice through the law, or would he take matters into his own hands? The path he chose would not only determine his fate, but also the fate of those he once held dear. In the days that followed, Marcus's demeanor changed. The man who once preached forgiveness now wrestled with a consuming rage. His sermons, once filled with hope and compassion, became filled with veiled threats and cryptic messages. The congregation noticed the shift, but none could have predicted the horror that would follow. One fateful afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the city, Marcus did the unbelievable to his wife and father. What happened behind closed doors would send shockwaves through the community. The next morning, the police were called to the two scenes. Inside, they found Clarence, and his life extinguished in a manner so brutal that even seasoned detectives were taken aback. And at the other scene, Tanya was lying dead too. The evidence pointed directly to Marcus. But the question remained, what drove a man of faith to commit such an atrocity? As the investigation unfolded, the community was left to grapple with the aftermath. The betrayal by Tanya and Clarence, the subsequent murder, and the unraveling of a family that once seemed unbreakable, all served as a stark reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface. In the end, Marcus was arrested and charged with the murder of his father. The trial captivated the nation, as it delved into themes of trust, betrayal, and the human capacity for violence. The once revered preacher now stood as a cautionary tale of how the deepest wounds can lead to the most tragic outcomes. This story serves as a chilling reminder that even those who seem the most devout can harbor darkness within. It underscores the devastating impact of betrayal and the lengths to which some will go when pushed to their limits. As the city of Miami continues to heal from the scars left by this tragedy, the tale of Marcus Johnson remains a poignant lesson in the fragility of trust and the destructive power of deception. Marcus Johnson, a man who had built his life on faith, had it all: family, community, respect. A preacher at one of Miami's most prominent churches, he was the embodiment of moral strength, the very picture of a devoted husband and father. His life was stable, or so it seemed, surrounded by his wife Tanya, their 3 young children, and his father Clarence. Together, they were the perfect family, strong in their beliefs, unwavering in their commitment to one another. For Marcus, his family was everything. Their home was filled with the sound of laughter and love, each day marked by prayer and reflection. But like many stories of betrayal, the cracks that began to form would soon shatter the illusion. It all began when a friend of Tanya's, someone she trusted, suggested the idea of taking a family DNA test. Initially, Tanya was hesitant. She didn't want to open a door that might lead to more questions than answers. But in the end, the pressure of keeping up appearances, of appearing as modern, health-conscious individuals, pushed her to agree. The suggestion seemed innocent enough. Take a test to understand genetic predispositions to health conditions. The idea seemed harmless, a routine checkup for peace of mind. However, Tanya couldn't shake the feeling of unease as they moved forward. She had her doubts, but the opportunity to avoid suspicion weighed on her. Marcus, ever trusting, agreed to take the test without much thought. They sent in their samples, and soon the results would arrive, marking the beginning of their unraveling. It wasn't long before the envelope appeared in their mailbox. Tanya, however, wasn't home when it arrived. She had gone out to run errands, leaving Marcus alone to open the mail. At first, he didn't think anything of it. But when he tore open the envelope, it felt like the ground beneath him shifted. The test results showed that Marcus wasn't the biological father of his children. Confusion flooded his mind as he stared at the paper. His thoughts became a blur. There had to be a mistake. He went over the details again, searching for some flaw in the data, but it was clear he was not the father. His heart raced. It wasn't possible. He had raised these children, watched them grow, loved them as his own. The sense of betrayal coursed through him like a dark tide. But it wasn't just a matter of biology. The discovery left him questioning everything. Tanya arrived home to find her world turned upside down. She knew what Marcus was holding in his hands. When he confronted her, his voice barely above a whisper, she broke down. It all spilled out. Tanya confessed. She told him about Clarence, his father, the man he had trusted most. For years, Clarence had been secretly involved with her. They had shared an affair, and Clarence was the biological father of Marcus's children. She explained how she had been manipulated, trapped by his father's control, and how everything had spiraled out of her control long before Marcus had any idea. Marcus stood there, motionless. The weight of her confession bore down on him like a crushing force. Clarence, his father, the man he had looked up to, the man he had followed in faith, had betrayed him in the worst way possible. Tanya had been complicit, but Clarence had been the orchestrator, pulling the strings and causing a rift in their family that no one could repair. The air in the room thickened. The world Marcus had carefully built around him crumbled with every word Tanya spoke. He tried to process what she was saying, but it felt as if his entire existence was slipping through his fingers. The anger, the confusion, the disbelief. It all melded together into a torrent that he could not control. His father, the man who had guided him in his spiritual journey, had been the one to destroy everything. For days, Marcus retreated into himself. His thoughts, tormented by betrayal, circled like vultures. He couldn't sleep, couldn't think clearly. The pain of knowing that his father and his wife had conspired against him tore at his soul. He would replay the words over and over in his head. He would question every moment, every smile, every interaction. How had he not seen it? How had he been blind to the lies that had poisoned his family for so long? But rage, uncontrollable, blinding rage, was beginning to take hold. The quiet preacher who had always stood for peace and understanding was now consumed with the need for retribution. His calm demeanor was cracking, and in its place, there was something darker. The more he thought about the betrayal, the more consumed he became with anger. It was only a matter of time before that anger would turn into something far more dangerous. The confrontation with Tanya came first. He couldn't look at her the same way anymore. His trust had been shattered. He had been her partner, her confidant, and she had lied to him. In his mind, it was unforgivable. When he finally faced her, the words he had been holding back poured out. The anger, the hurt, the betrayal, it all came crashing down in a moment of violent reckoning. What followed was something that neither of them could have predicted. As Marcus stepped out of his car and onto the humid streets of Miami, the neighborhood that had once been so familiar to him felt foreign. The air seemed thick, suffocating with tension. It wasn't the sweltering heat of the city that weighed on him. It was something far more dangerous, an internal storm that threatened to consume him completely. The sun, once a comforting source of light, felt like an oppressive weight on his shoulders as he walked toward the house. His mind was no longer a place of peace. It was a battleground, and at the center of this war was the violent, unrelenting fury that had overtaken him. His heart pounded with each step, the betrayal of his wife and father echoing in his chest like a hammer strike. He had trusted them. He had loved them, and they had torn apart everything that he had worked for, everything that he had believed in. The world he had built, the faith he had relied on, had all been shattered in an instant. And now there was only one thing left: revenge. The house loomed before him, a once comforting refuge, now a symbol of all that had been lost. Inside, Tanya was waiting for him, unaware of the storm that had already begun to take shape. He had seen the pain in her eyes when she confessed, but it was nothing compared to what he was feeling now. He had tried to reason with himself. He had tried to understand her actions, her betrayal. But all that remained was an unrelenting, burning hatred. She had betrayed him not just with her body but with his entire life, his faith, and everything he stood for. She had destroyed him, and now she would face the consequences. The door opened slowly, almost as if Tanya had sensed the change in him. The smile that once greeted him was gone. In its place was a mixture of fear and sadness. Sadness that only served to fuel his rage. The silence between them felt suffocating. Tanya took a step forward, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Marcus, please, we can talk." Every word she spoke felt like a slap, an insult to everything he had believed in. He reached for her, grabbing her wrist with an almost unnatural force. "You ruined everything," he growled, his voice barely recognizable as his own. "You lied to me for years. You betrayed me with him." He could barely breathe through the overwhelming tide of anger that surged inside him. Tanya's eyes widened in horror as Marcus's grip tightened. She tried to pull away, but it was futile. He was too far gone. The once calm preacher had been replaced by something far darker. His mind was no longer focused on reason. It was consumed by one singular thought: retribution. He dragged her toward the kitchen, his steps heavy with each movement. Tanya's cries fell on deaf ears. In the kitchen, the violence that had been simmering for days finally erupted. Marcus shoved Tanya to the ground, her body hitting the floor with a sickening thud. She gasped for breath, looking up at him in disbelief. But Marcus didn't stop. The rage had overtaken him completely, turning him into something unrecognizable. He didn't know how it happened, but in a flash he was holding a knife. The cold steel gleamed under the kitchen light, a stark contrast to the heat of the moment. The act itself was swift, brutal, and unforgiving. Marcus didn't hesitate. The blade sank into Tanya's body with a sickening finality. She screamed, a guttural sound that sent chills down his spine, but it was drowned out by the sound of his heartbeat pounding in his ears. With each strike, the pain of betrayal seemed to ease, but it was never enough. He needed more. He needed to make her feel the destruction she had caused. The knife flashed again and again, and with every strike, Marcus felt a small piece of himself being lost forever. His humanity, his faith, his love for the woman who had once been his everything gone. When it was over, when Tanya lay motionless on the cold kitchen floor, Marcus didn't feel relief. There was no sense of closure, no satisfaction in the destruction he had just wrought. Instead, there was emptiness, an abyss that seemed to stretch on forever. He stared at her body, his mind blank. The woman who had once been his partner, the mother of his children, was gone. But something inside him told him that this wasn't enough. Not yet. Clarence still remained, and he too had to pay for his role in this twisted betrayal. Marcus left the house without a second glance at Tanya's lifeless form. His hands trembled, the knife still slick with her blood. He had been driven by something beyond reason, beyond sanity. He needed to finish what he had started. And his father, Clarence, was next. The confrontation with Clarence was far more brutal than he could have imagined. When he arrived at Clarence's home, the air around him seemed thick with anticipation. The old man had to know what was coming. How could he not? Marcus had been his son, his flesh and blood, and yet Clarence had allowed himself to betray him in the most grotesque way possible. It was almost as if he were waiting for Marcus to arrive, as if he knew this was inevitable. But nothing could prepare Clarence for what would happen next. The violence that erupted was even more violent than with Tanya. Clarence, unable to move as quickly as he once had, stood no chance against the fury of his own son. Marcus attacked him with such intensity that it was almost as if he were trying to erase him from existence. He struck him again and again, the sound of flesh meeting metal echoing through the house. Clarence's cries for mercy were silenced quickly, drowned out by the overwhelming roar of Marcus's anger. With each blow, Marcus felt a strange sense of release, as if the weight of his betrayal was being lifted, piece by piece. But with each strike, something darker grew inside him, something that could never be undone. The man he had once been was slipping further and further away with every act of violence. The brutal deaths of Tanya and Clarence marked the end of Marcus's descent. He was no longer the man he had once been. There was no turning back. The Miami skyline, once a symbol of hope and community, now stood as a silent witness to the violence and bloodshed that had unfolded. The family home, the house that had once been filled with love, was now a place of death, and Marcus, standing over the bodies of his loved ones, was a man forever lost. In his quest for vengeance, he had destroyed not only those who had wronged him, but everything he had once held dear. And now, as the blood dried on his hands, Marcus had to face the truth. His journey for justice had led him to the darkest place imaginable, where redemption no longer existed. The pieces of Marcus's shattered world were not only broken by his own actions but by the betrayal of those closest to him, Tanya and Clarence. Tanya, once the loving and devoted wife, had been manipulated and coerced by Clarence into a deceit so deep it would unravel everything. Her emotions in the wake of Marcus's discovery of the affair were a whirlwind of guilt, fear, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. When Tanya first found herself entangled in her father-in-law's web of manipulation, she had felt as though she had no choice. Clarence, with his silver tongue and years of experience as a trusted figure in Marcus's life, had found the cracks in her defenses and exploited them. Tanya had never intended to betray her husband, the man she had loved, the man who had built their life together. But as Clarence drew her in, promising her validation and comfort in her vulnerabilities, she found herself unable to resist. The affair began under a veil of secrecy, with Clarence becoming more insistent, more controlling. Tanya, feeling suffocated by the pressures of her life, found herself drawn to his comfort, his attention, things she hadn't felt in years. But she was never truly free in this deception. Clarence had always held the strings, and Tanya had become his pawn. It wasn't until the DNA test, the catalyst of Marcus's wrath, that Tanya's guilt became undeniable. It had been a few weeks since their first encounter when Marcus nearly caught them. Clarence had stayed late one night, long after Tanya had turned off the lights to sleep. Marcus had returned home earlier than expected from a meeting, his car quietly pulling into the driveway. Through the window, he saw the faint silhouette of two figures in the dimly lit guest room, standing closer than they ever should have. He had no reason to suspect them. His father, the man who had raised him, the man who had taught him everything about trust, and Tanya, the woman he had vowed to cherish. Couldn't be. But just as Marcus was about to walk into the house, he froze. A sound, the subtle click of a door closing. He shook his head, thinking it was nothing, and continued inside. What he didn't know was that Clarence and Tanya had been in that room moments before, their clothes hastily put back on, their hearts racing with the guilt of being caught too close to crossing the line. They exchanged a brief, fleeting glance, one filled with panic, as if both of them knew that if Marcus came through that door right now, the truth would shatter everything. They scrambled for any sense of normalcy, but it was already too late. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. As Marcus walked past the guest room that night, his eyes briefly locked onto the jacket hanging carelessly on the back of the chair. The same jacket Clarence had worn earlier. It was just a small detail easily overlooked. But in that fleeting moment, Clarence and Tanya had narrowly escaped being caught. When Marcus discovered the truth, Tanya's reaction was not one of pride, but of a woman broken by her own choices. She had hoped, foolishly, that perhaps her husband would never uncover the truth. But when the day came, the weight of her betrayal came crashing down on her. Tanya's demeanor shifted immediately from a defensive wife to a desperate woman, pleading for mercy. Tanya's desperation was evident in her every word, in every tear that fell. She could no longer justify her actions, and as she attempted to explain her way through her guilt, it became clear that nothing could repair the damage. The reality was too raw, too horrific for her to undo. It wasn't just the affair that hurt Marcus. It was the broken trust, the destruction of everything they had built together. But Tanya wasn't the only one to blame. Clarence, the father of Marcus, was the true architect of the disaster. As the story unfolded, it became apparent that Clarence's manipulative nature was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. He wasn't merely a man who had crossed a line. He was the man who had orchestrated Marcus's downfall. What started as a father-son bond, a relationship built on trust and respect, had twisted into something far darker. Clarence had not only destroyed his son's life, but he had done so with cold calculation. Clarence had known exactly what he was doing. He had recognized Tanya's vulnerabilities and had used them to his advantage, all while maintaining the facade of the trusted patriarch. For years, he had been a pillar of the community, a respected figure within the family, a man who had seen and done it all. But behind that mask of decency, he had been plotting his betrayal, using his position to manipulate the very people who had loved him most. In the final confrontation with Clarence, Marcus was no longer the preacher of peace. He had been transformed into something else entirely, a man driven by raw emotion, guided only by the desire to destroy those who had torn his world apart. Marcus sat in the dimly lit cell, the weight of the world bearing down on him. He was a man who had dedicated his life to faith, to his family, to his community. But now, those very arms, once outstretched in love and protection, were clenched in fury and regret. How could they have done this to him? How could the two people he trusted most, the ones who had shaped his world, betray him in the most intimate and heartbreaking way possible? When Marcus stood at the crossroads of rage and sorrow, his children, his innocent children, were the tragic casualties of his emotional conflict. They were unaware of the twisted reality that had unfolded before them. The three young faces, who had once looked up to their father with admiration, would never fully understand the depth of the pain he felt, the depths of the lies and deceit that had been woven into the fabric of their family. The kids were still so young. They were too young to comprehend the seismic shift in their lives, too young to know that their mother, the woman who had loved them and cared for them, had betrayed their father, too young to understand that their grandfather, the man who had always been a comforting presence in their lives, had caused the very destruction that shattered their family. Now they would grow up in foster care, separated from their father, and from each other, the bond they once shared broken irreparably by the acts of the people who should have cared for them the most. It's a painful irony. Marcus had once lived to shield his children from harm, to protect them from the harshness of the world. Now, the only harm they knew was the one he had inflicted upon their lives. The tragic reality of their fate left a void in his soul, a void that no amount of justice, no amount of vengeance, could ever fill. As the investigation unfolded, the legal consequences for Marcus's actions became clear. The brutality of his revenge, his violent killings of Tanya and Clarence, was undeniable. The police arrived to a crime scene filled with evidence, blood, signs of a struggle, and the aftermath of Marcus's vengeful outburst. The Bible that had once represented his faith now lay discarded, a grim reminder of what he had done. When arrested, Marcus appeared detached. In his statement, he calmly explained that he had acted in response to the deep betrayal from his wife and father. But the weight of his actions began to settle in as the investigation progressed. The man who had once preached faith and forgiveness now faced the harsh reality of his crime. During the trial, the defense argued that Marcus had been driven to madness by years of emotional turmoil. However, the prosecution painted a different picture, focusing on the premeditated nature of his actions. The graphic details of the murders left no room for doubt. Marcus had consciously chosen to exact his revenge, and the law could not excuse such violence, no matter the emotional pain behind it. After deliberation, the jury found Marcus guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, acknowledging the emotional devastation he had suffered, but emphasizing that the brutality of the crime could not go unpunished. As Marcus was led away in shackles, there was no anger or remorse on his face, only emptiness. His life, his family, his faith, and his future had been shattered in one violent moment. Marcus's children, the innocent victims caught in the aftermath of their father's rage, became another tragic part of the story. Before the brutal events unfolded, they had been like any other children, growing up in a household they believed to be full of love and safety. As the story concludes, the audience is left with a haunting question. Do you believe Marcus's actions were the result of an unforgivable betrayal, or did he take things too far? This question serves as a powerful invitation to reflect on the moral complexities at play. Was Marcus driven to violence by the immense pain of betrayal, or did he cross a line that no amount of suffering could justify? The story forces us to confront the age-old dilemma of justice versus vengeance. How far is too far when it comes to punishing betrayal? Could Marcus have found a way to cope with the overwhelming hurt without resorting to violence, or was his reaction inevitable? And, if you were in his shoes, would you have been able to forgive your wife and father for such a devastating betrayal, or would the pain have driven you to a similar breaking point? These questions linger in the air, urging the audience to consider the limits of forgiveness and the consequences of unchecked rage. As you reflect on the story, we invite you to share your thoughts. Would you have been able to forgive Marcus's family, or would the betrayal have led you down the same dark path? If this story left you questioning the boundaries of justice and morality, be sure to subscribe for more thought-provoking cases that explore the complexities of human emotion, conflict,